Leonardo Concino Perez is a Chilean social researcher and ethnographer whose work engages with collective imaginaries, social movements and alternative economic practices within neoliberal contexts. He earned a doctorate in social sciences at Universidad de Chile, and has produced field-based studies of pro-sustainability settlements in Chile, where he analyzes how residents develop collective practices, such as mingas and volunteering, that oscillate between precarious labor and reciprocal economies. He also conducted ethnographic research on the Movimiento Arcoiris, Rainbow Movement, in Chile, tracing how emergent social groups materialize utopian aspirations, negotiate tensions and construct imaginaries of autonomy. His thematic concerns include autonomy, community formation, everyday practices and the interplay of culture and politics, drawing on traditions of social theory and imaginaries. This 2016 Spanish-language paper, Drifts and Tensions in the Materialization of Utopia, an ethnography of the Rainbow Movement in Chile, examines how the Rainbow Movement in Chile attempts to materialize its utopian vision through everyday collective practices centered on ecology, spirituality, and communal living. Drawing on ethnographic fieldwork from 2009 to 2013 and interviews with key participants, the study identifies core practices such as the annual Rainbow Gathering, bioconstruction, and the Circle of Visions as mechanisms through which participants reshape their relationship with nature and experiment with horizontal, consensus-based forms of collective action. The gatherings function as spaces of resocialization where individuals adapt to natural rhythms, develop emotional and spiritual bonds with the environment and explore alternative ways of living. Bioconstruction expresses a critique of industrial production by using recycled and local materials, while also linking the movement to broader networks of ecological activism. The Circle of Visions illustrates an aspiration toward non-hierarchical decision-making, but also exposes practical tensions in sustaining consensus and applying agreements. The paper concludes that although the movement expands culturally and challenges dominant imaginaries, it faces structural and internal limits, highlighting the need to rethink utopia as a collective, evolving process rather than a fixed endpoint. The introduction situates the study within the broader dominance of neoliberalism, which shapes political, economic and social life by centering market logics and influencing everyday subjectivities. In response to this order, social movements become key arenas where tensions, conflicts and alternative visions emerge. Within this landscape, the paper focuses on the Rainbow Movement in Chile as an example of a collective that attempts to build ways of living that challenge prevailing norms. The author frames the research objective as examining how this movement seeks to materialize a utopian imaginary through its everyday practices and communal experimentation. Focus on the Rainbow Movement in Chile highlights the Rainbow Movement in Chile as a case through which to observe how a contemporary social movement experiments with alternative ways of living that challenge dominant cultural norms. It introduces the movement as a network of gatherings and communities that blend ecological concern, spirituality and collective autonomy, making it a valuable site for examining how groups attempt to embody their ideals in daily practice. Historical background of the Rainbow Movement explains that the Rainbow Movement emerged from the U.S. countercultural milieu of the late 1960s and early 1970s, holding its first large gatherings as expressions of anti-establishment communalism and spiritual experimentation. From these beginnings, the movement spread across multiple continents, adopting a nomadic and decentralized character. It arrived in Chile around 2004 to 2005, where annual gatherings quickly multiplied and grew, drawing hundreds to more than 1,000 participants over the next decade. During this period, the movement also fostered the creation of semi-permanent rural and urban communities, traveling caravans and links with other activist networks, including Mapuche groups, eco-villages and spiritual collectives. The movement reached Chile around 2004 to 2005, marked by its first gathering in Fresha, and quickly established an annual presence. Subsequent gatherings took place in Canay, El Toyo, Conaripe, Chanlio, Liquin, Los Alpes, Quilolio, and Pajeri, occurring almost every year through 2016. Over this period, attendance grew from a few dozen people to well over 1,000, and the gatherings helped stimulate the formation of eco-communities, traveling caravans and a wider network of participants who continued engaging with the movement beyond the events themselves. Theoretical and methodological framework situates the study within identity-oriented approaches to social movements, emphasizing cultural meaning and everyday practice rather than formal political strategy. Drawing on Castoriadis' concept of social imaginaries, the author defines the imaginario colectivo as the set of shared practices and significations through which a group gives shape to its worldview. The research methodology consists of a 4-year ethnography combining participant observation in gatherings and settlements with 10 semi-structured interviews selected for their involvement in key initiatives. The material is interpreted through hermeneutic analysis, and the findings are organized into an analytic schema that connects practices with the underlying meanings that structure the movement's collective life. The study identifies 9 recurring or sedimented practices that structure the everyday life of the Rainbow movement in Chile. These practices are the routine, collective activities through which the movement expresses and stabilizes its way of being. They emerge across multiple encounters and community settings, showing a degree of continuity despite the movement's fluid and decentralized character. Across these practices, 3 central meanings consistently surface: ecological care, spiritual connection, and communal living. These themes form the core of the movement's collective imaginary, shaping how participants relate to nature, to one another, and to the broader social world. They also guide the movement's critique of dominant cultural and economic norms, particularly those associated with industrial modernity and neoliberal individualism. For analytic depth, the paper concentrates on 3 practices that most clearly reveal these meanings: the annual Rainbow Gathering, bioconstruction efforts, and the Circle of Visions. Each practice embodies the movement's values in a distinct domain: ritualized communal life, ecological building, and consensus-based decision-making, allowing the study to illustrate how the movement attempts to materialize its utopian aspirations in lived experience. The Rainbow Gathering in Chile is described as a month-long event structured in 3 main phases: the seed camp, the gathering itself, and the campamento rastrillo. The seed camp occurs about a week before the official start and is dedicated to preparing the site, building basic infrastructure such as kitchen, latrines, reception areas, camping zones, and the ceremonial fuego sagrado, typically using organic or recycled materials. The gathering then unfolds over an entire lunar cycle of 28 days, followed by the campamento rastrillo, when participants dismantle structures, clean the area, and attempt to leave minimal trace on the land. Organizationally, the gathering is based on voluntary labor, mutual aid, and an explicit rejection of formal hierarchies. There is no entry fee, no sponsorship, and no centralized funding. Resources are obtained via donations, shared contributions, and barter. A small rotating group of particularly active participants usually assumes much of the daily work, but roles are not formally assigned. The guiding principle is encapsulated in the slogan, "If you see a task, it is yours," which encourages individuals to take initiative without top-down coordination, even though this ideal does not always result in an equal distribution of effort. Daily life in the gathering is marked by a wide range of activities that collectively foster a sense of communal experimentation. These include communal vegetarian meals, open workshops on arts, crafts, and skills, musical jam sessions, mantras and songs dedicated to Mother Earth, nudity in everyday contexts, theatrical performances, and rituals drawing on traditions and Eastern traditions. There are also meetings to make collective decisions, voluntary work for cooking, cleaning, and infrastructure, and occasional outreach actions such as ecological interventions in nearby localities. The atmosphere is intentionally playful, effective, and ritualized, designed to contrast with urban routines and to support intensive social interaction. Newcomers generally experience the gathering as a process with 3 stages: attraction, emotional destabilization, and eventual adaptation. They are first drawn in by the promise of a free, communal, nature-based event where knowledge is shared and hierarchies are minimized. Once inside, many report a strong destabilizing effect. Their habits and assumptions are challenged by practices such as communal defecation facilities, washing dishes with ash, unfamiliar nudity, and new forms of intimacy, as well as by seeing their own issues mirrored in others. Over time, those who stay tend to adapt to the altered rhythms and norms, beginning to feel part of a family and valuing the slower pace structured by natural cycles rather than clock time. A central theme of the gathering is the reconnection with and protection of nature. Participants see the event as a kind of portal or laboratory for healing the human-nature relationship, shifting from a stance of domination and consumption to one of respect, cohabitation, and spiritual bonding. The absence of electricity and technological distractions, the reliance on fire and water from the environment, and the deliberate alignment with solar and lunar cycles, are meant to immerse people in a more organic temporal and sensory experience. Through this, the gathering aims not only to promote ecological practices but to cultivate an effective and spiritual commitment to environmental care. The impact of the gathering is ambivalent and complex. For many, the experience is transformative, leading to quitting jobs or studies, joining caravans, founding or moving into eco-communities, and adopting new value frameworks centered on community and ecology. It has played a key role in spreading the rainbow movement across Chile and linking it with other activist and spiritual networks. At the same time, the gathering reveals internal tensions. Work is unevenly distributed. Some participants resist rules such as bans on alcohol or expectations around environmental care. Families or individuals may feel uncomfortable with nudity or intensity, and agreements reached in assemblies are often inconsistently implemented. Thus, the gathering both embodies the movement's utopian aspirations and exposes the practical and relational limits of living by these ideals in a diverse and fluid community. The section on bioconstruction describes it as a set of building techniques that rely on recycled materials and locally available natural resources, such as earth, wood, stone, and plant fibers, to minimize environmental impact. Within the rainbow movement, these methods serve not only practical needs but also link participants to wider ecological and permaculture networks through workshops, collective projects, and exchange of knowledge. In permanent or semi-permanent settlements influenced by the movement, bioconstruction becomes part of everyday life, guiding how spaces are organized, how structures are built, and how resources are managed. The practice carries meanings tied to ecological responsibility, a critique of industrial modes of production, and the creation of community through shared labor and sustainable design. The Circle of Visions, or Vision Council, is presented as the rainbow movement's primary consensus-based decision-making practice, used when the group must address complex or sensitive topics such as founding a community, expelling a member, or selecting organizers for a future gathering. It aims to create a deliberative process in which all participants can voice their perspectives without the presence of formal leadership or majority voting. The practice reflects the movement's aspiration to resolve issues collectively while fostering shared responsibility for outcomes. Structurally, a circle of visions includes a focalizer, who convenes the group and outlines the issue at hand, the participants, who may join or leave at any time, a defined thematic purpose, and the bastón de la palabra, a ceremonial talking stick that regulates turns to speak. The focalizer sets the initial frame, after which the bastón is passed clockwise, granting each person the right to speak or remain silent while others listen. This mechanism is meant to slow the pace of discussion, encourage reflection, and ensure that all voices have equal opportunity to contribute. Participants describe the circle as a sacred space rooted in ancestral traditions of communal deliberation. They view it as a ritual setting where individuals speak from the heart and receive guidance from a higher spiritual source, often referred to as the Great Spirit. The circular arrangement symbolizes continuity and unity, and the act of holding the bastón is considered a way of channeling wisdom rather than asserting personal authority. This spiritual framing lends the practice a sense of gravity and collective intention. The circle emphasizes equality, respectful listening, and emotional openness. The lack of hierarchical roles and the use of the talking stick encourage participants to listen attentively rather than compete for airtime. Many describe the experience as a training in deep listening, self-restraint, and empathy, where silence and emotional vulnerability become tools for building shared understanding. The practice assumes that consensus emerges not from debate but from attunement among participants as they integrate diverse viewpoints. Despite its ideal of harmonious consensus, the Circle of Visions faces practical tensions and limitations. Discussions often drift from the original topic due to the open structure and the arrival of new participants who need to be updated or introduce additional concerns. Some individuals may veto widely supported proposals, preventing agreement, and even when consensuses are reached, they are frequently not implemented consistently. These issues reveal the difficulty of sustaining egalitarian deliberation in fluid, large, and heterogeneous groups, illustrating both the movement's commitment to horizontalism and the challenges it encounters in putting that ideal into practice. The discussion argues that the rainbow movement in Chile challenges dominant ideas about nature and social organization that are shaped by neoliberalism and industrial modernity. Rather than treating nature as a resource to be exploited, the movement frames it as a living totality or even a spiritual subject with which humans must coexist respectfully. At the same time, it proposes forms of social organization that depart from state-centered politics and market logics, experimenting instead with communal, non-mercantile relations and a critique of consumerist lifestyles. A key point is that the annual gatherings function as spaces of resocialization, where participants temporarily step out of urban, accelerated, market-driven routines and learn to live according to natural rhythms and communal practices. Solar, lunar, and biological cycles become reference points for organizing time, activities, and relationships. Through this immersion, the movement fosters new habits, sensibilities, and meanings that can later be carried into everyday life outside the gatherings, helping to diffuse its ecological, spiritual, and communal imaginary. Bioconstruction is interpreted as a practice that embodies a concrete alternative to industrial production, since it relies on recycled materials, local resources and collective work outside conventional market relations. However, the discussion also notes that such practices are vulnerable to green commodification. Techniques and aesthetics associated with ecological building can be captured by real estate markets and transformed into high-cost eco-products, limiting access and diluting their critical edge. The paper suggests that both dynamics may unfold in parallel: bioconstruction as a common good and as a niche commodity. On the political level, the movement is read as part of a broader shift toward forms of collective autonomy and horizontalism. Instead of channeling demands through parties or formal institutions, participants invest their political energy in everyday relationships, shared decisions and attempts to self-organize life in common. The emphasis on autonomy, community and direct experience aligns the Rainbow movement with other contemporary movements that seek radical democracy, understood as expanding direct participation and reducing vertical authority and social coordination. At the same time, the paper highlights clear limits to the movement's consensus-based methods, especially when considered at larger scales. The circle of visions, while consistent with horizontal ideals, is time-consuming, prone to fragmentation and dependent on participants' commitment to follow through on agreements. Vetoes, topic drift and non-compliance with consensuses show how difficult it is to sustain collective decision-making without some form of stable structure or enforcement. These tensions are presented not as failures that invalidate the utopian project, but as indicators that utopia must be conceived as an open, evolving process, continually negotiated and constrained by real social conditions. The conclusion emphasizes that the effort to materialize utopia is not a linear achievement but an ongoing, adaptive and often contested process. Within the Rainbow movement, attempts to embody ecological, spiritual and communal values reveal both the possibilities of lived alternatives and the frictions that arise when ideals meet the realities of daily practice. Utopian experimentation unfolds through constant negotiation, adjustment and reinterpretation. The movement's growth in Chile, seen in the expansion of gatherings, communities and networks, shows that its cultural influence has extended beyond isolated events and into broader social spaces. At the same time, structural constraints remain significant. Limited scale, internal inconsistencies, and the vulnerability of its practices to cooptation or dilution demonstrate that the movement's impact is both real and bounded. Taken together, these dynamics suggest the need to rethink utopia not as a fixed destination or blueprint, but as a horizon that evolves collectively through experience. The conclusion proposes understanding utopia as a shared, dynamic field of experimentation where aspirations are continually shaped by dialogue, conflict, and adaptation within the social world. The paper gives a series of short, concrete scenes that, together, allow a fairly clear picture of rainbow gatherings in Chile. People usually arrive after hearing about the gathering in very informal ways. One interview recalls meeting a girl from the circus world who described it as a free encounter in nature where people share workshops on juggling and circus arts, and where even if you do not know how to do anything, everyone will be open-hearted and willing to teach. Another tells of receiving a simple email, an invitation to come live for a time on the land, by the river, to play at community with shared meals and shared work, trying out what life in community could feel like. For several participants, this is their very first exposure to this kind of environment. The gatherings are held in remote places, mountain valleys, forested areas or pre-Cordillera zones, far from big cities, without electricity, piped water, sewage or mobile phone signal. Before the main event, a smaller group arrives for the seed camp. They zone the land, deciding where to place tents, kitchen, washing areas, latrines, the fuego sagrado and other communal spaces. One interview remembers the arrival to a new site full of goats, unloading the food while the goats tried to eat it, and using a large tree that received them as the reference point for the first structure, the Refugio del Guerrero, a basic, collectively built shelter. Around this shelter, they place the first garden beds and begin to organize the territory more systematically, sometimes taking advice from those with permaculture experience. Daily life at the gathering mixes simple routines with constant activity. People cook and eat vegetarian meals in common, sit around the fire, sing, improvise music and experiment with different rhythms and instruments. There are workshops on crafts such as weaving, macrame or loom work, as well as on music, bodily practices and various spiritual techniques. Nudity is normalized in many spaces. The absence of electric light and strict schedules makes solar and lunar cycles important references. Participants emphasize how, over days, they begin to live according to the rhythm of the day, the night, and the moon, rather than clocks. These rhythms shape encounters. You see the same people in different situations and times, and slowly everyone becomes known, as one interviewee puts it. Newcomers often describe a sequence of attraction, shock and adaptation. The initial attraction comes from the promise of community, free learning, and life in nature. Once there, many speak of internal disorganization. One participant liked the phrase that the gathering is the biggest disorganization in the world, not only socially but also internally, because it destabilizes one's usual habits and emotional structures. Another recounts being in shock at having to adapt from private, enclosed bathrooms to shared latrines, or from dish soap to washing dishes with ash. The dirt underfoot is no longer read as dirtiness but as just earth, and this shift in perception is experienced as a move to the other extreme of reality. Some people find this freeing and slowly feel part of a family. Others feel overwhelmed and leave. The gatherings also produce visible conflicts and departures. The paper mentions people who go away quickly because they disagree with rules such as bans on alcohol or because they are uncomfortable with nudity. A family with small children is cited as leaving for this reason. There are also cases where participants become frustrated when they cannot reproduce the emotional intensity of previous gatherings. In everyday functioning, a small rotating core of about 20 people tends to take on most of the work, despite the slogan, "If you see a task, it is yours." Some participants try to impose their own vision on the group, or simply ignore collective agreements, which generates tension around the ideal of horizontality. Bioconstruction and ecological care appear in very concrete practices. In some sites, participants collect large quantities of rubbish from the surroundings, turning plastic waste into ecological bricks by tightly stuffing bottles, and reusing Tetra Pak cartons as roofing for shelters. One interviewee describes this as their main contribution to a place: clean, 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 then transform waste into useful material. There is also experimentation with weaving plastic bags into yarn for textiles and sculptural uses. These activities are justified through a view of nature as something sacred and alive, within which humans should act as one species among others, rather than as invaders. Cleaning, recycling, and constructing in this way are seen as concrete forms of respect. Decision-making appears in the vignettes through the circle of visions. Participants sit in a circle, at the same height, often referencing ancestral traditions where elders met this way. A focalizer opens the circle, explains the topic, and then a bastón de la palabra, talking stick, circulates clockwise. The person holding it may speak or remain silent, often beginning with a brief formula such as aho or gran espiritu, and the rest listen without interruption. Interviewees describe this as a sacred space where people try to speak from the heart rather than from personal ego, and as a practice of listening in which one can change one's own view by hearing others. At the same time, some recount long circles where topics drift, individuals veto widely supported proposals, or agreements are never carried out in practice, leading to fatigue and doubt about the method's effectiveness. Taken together, these vignettes portray rainbow gatherings in Chile as temporary, improvised villages in remote landscapes, built and sustained through voluntary work, informal norms, and a mix of ecological, spiritual, and communal practices. For some, they are life-changing laboratories that open the possibility of new ways of living. For others, they are disorienting or uncomfortable experiments that they choose not to repeat. The scenes in the paper show both sides: the enthusiasm of those who feel they have found a family and a different relation to nature, and the frustrations and limits that appear when very diverse people try to live out an egalitarian, utopian ideal in concrete conditions.